Lonely rancher. Bought a cabin, sight unseen. He found a beautiful woman living there. Part 1. The Montana Valley was a forgotten wound in the earth, a place that bled solitude, regret, and a chilling, fragile hope. For Clay Blackwood, this was the end of the world, and the only place he could live in it. He spurred his horse on the legal deed in his saddlebag, feeling like a final prayer. He'd bought this patch of hell sight unseen, a desperate man's gamble. This was it, his fortress against the ghosts, the ghost of a fevered room of a promise he couldn't keep. The cabin materialized through the pines, a dark, ramshackle silhouette. Perfect. Until he saw it. A pale curl of smoke, impossibly white, rising from the stone chimney. His blood ran cold. He reined in his horse, his hand instinctively finding the familiar cold comfort of his Colt. The fortress had been breached before he'd even arrived. Where are you listening to our story from tonight? Silence from the cannon's roar that still echoed in the hollows of his memory. Silence from the city's clatter, a frantic noise that felt like insects crawling on his skin. And silence, most of all, from the ghost of a whispered last breath in a fevered room, a sound that had followed him across a continent. He was a soldier. He knew how to hold a line. This was just the last line he would ever have to hold. The trees parted and he saw it. The cabin. It was a dark, ramshackle thing built of rough-hewn logs that had gone gray with years of sun and snow. It slumped against the hillside like a tired old man. It was imperfect. It was broken. It was perfect. A faint smile, a ghost of a thing he hadn't felt in years, almost touched his lips. He urged his horse forward, a feeling dangerously close to peace settling in his chest. And then he saw it. His blood did not run cold. It froze. From the clumsy stone chimney, a thin curl of smoke rose into the pale sky. Impossibly white. Impossibly alive. A single, defiant breath in a place he had bought for its emptiness. He pulled his roan to a sudden jarring halt, the horse tossing its head in protest. The fragile piece shattered into 1,000 icy shards. His hand of its own accord dropped to the worn walnut grip of his Colt. The movement was fluid, instinctive, a muscle memory carved into his soul by years of survival. The fortress had been breached before he'd even claimed it. A trespasser, a squatter, a varmint to be cleared. Who would build a fire in a place that God himself had turned his back on? He dismounted without a sound, his boots sinking into the soft pine needles. He moved with a predator's grace, using the thick trunks of the lodgepole pines as cover, his eyes locked on the cabin. Every window was a dark, vacant eye. The front door was shut tight, but the smoke did not lie. He reached the edge of the clearing, his heart a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He could storm it. He could call out. Or he could wait. He had waited in the suffocating humidity of a Georgia swamp for 3 days, once waiting for a single shot. He could wait here. But he was tired of waiting. He was tired of war. He stepped out from the cover of the trees, his boots crunching on the gravel. The sound, an open declaration. He walked directly toward the front door, his thumb resting on the hammer of his pistol. The door creaked open before he reached it. She stood framed in the doorway, and the sight of her was a stranger, more profound shock than the smoke. She was not the grizzled, half-starved prospector he'd expected. She was young, her face framed by a cascade of dark, untamed hair. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were wide, but held no fear. Only a deep, defiant, bottomless stillness. In her hands, she held a long-barreled shotgun, and she held it with the casual competence of a woman who knew precisely how to use it. "That's far enough, mister," she said. Her voice was low and clear without a tremor. Clay stopped his hand, never leaving his Colt. "This is my property." He stated his own voice, a low gravel rough from disuse. The woman's expression didn't change. A flicker of something amusement-pity crossed her features before being locked away again. "This is my home." "I have the deed," he said, nodding toward his horse. "Signed and sealed in Helena. Blackwood. Lot 7. "I don't care if you have a deed signed by the president himself." She answered the twin barrels of the shotgun, unwavering. "You're not the first man to come here with a piece of paper thinking it gives him the right to own the world. Now, I suggest you get back on your horse and ride on. There's nothing for you here." He looked at her, truly looked at her then. At the fine line of her jaw, the stubborn set of her shoulders. He saw the exhaustion hiding deep in her eyes, the same kind of bone-deep weariness he felt in his own soul. He could draw on her. He could end this. But the thought left a sour taste in his mouth. He was done ending things. "Ma'am," he said, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. "The sun's going down. There's a storm coming in from the north. I'm not leaving." He took a step forward. The click of the shotgun's hammers being pulled back was the only sound in the vast, silent valley. The twin clicks of the shotgun hammers echoed in the vast, empty bowl of the valley. It was a final metallic sound. A full stop. Clay Blackwood did not flinch. He did not move for his gun. He simply stood there, a statue of weary resolve, and let the woman's challenge hang in the freezing air between them. He had faced down charging cavalry lines and the silent, screaming mouths of cannons. He would not be broken by this. He slowly, deliberately raised his left hand palm open and empty. A gesture of peace, or at least of truce. "I'm not looking for a fight, ma'am," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to push back against the rising wind. "I'm just looking for a place to get out of this storm." He tilted his head toward the north, where the sky was turning a bruised, angry purple over the mountaintops. "That wind has teeth. It'll strip the flesh from a man's bones before morning. You know that as well as I do." The woman Cora, she'd called herself a name too simple for the fire in her eyes, did not lower the shotgun. But he saw her gaze flicker to the darkening sky. He saw the subtle tightening of her jaw. She was a fortress, but even a fortress has to acknowledge the world outside its walls. "This mountain is full of caves," she shot back, her voice sharp. "Go find one. My horse won't make it. And I paid for that roof over your head." He said the words harder than he intended. He saw a flash of anger in her eyes and a sliver of something else, something that looked like fear. He reined himself in. "Look, I don't want your home. I just want the night. Give me a corner of the floor, or the barn if there is one. When the storm breaks, I'll be on my way." It was a lie. He had no intention of leaving. But it was a necessary lie. A key to unlock this standoff. She stared at him for a long, silent moment, the wind whipping a loose strand of dark hair across her face. He saw the war inside her, the war between her fear of him and her fear of the mountain's cold justice. To turn him away was to sentence him to death, to let him in. What was that a sentence to? Was her secret more dangerous than a blizzard? Finally, with a sharp, resentful sigh, she gave the slightest nod of her head. "The barn. There's hay. It's warmer than a cave." She gestured with the barrel of the shotgun. "It's back behind the cabin. Don't even think about coming near the main house. I'll be watching." Clay nodded once, a gesture of grim acceptance. He turned, walked back to his horse, and untied the small saddle roll that held all his worldly possessions. He did not go to the barn. Instead, he walked back toward her, stopping a good 10 feet from the door. He dropped his saddle roll in the dirt. Then he unbuckled his gun belt and laid the heavy Colt, his last and most constant companion, on top of the roll. An offering. A gesture of trust he didn't feel. Her eyes widened in surprise. The barrels of the shotgun lowered just an inch. It was enough. "The floor," she said, her voice softer now, barely a whisper. You can have the floor. But the gun stays out here. He didn't argue. He kicked the gun belt further from the door, then stepped over the threshold into the lion's den. The air inside was warm, smelling of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something else. Books. A tall, precarious stack of them sat by the hearth. The single room was sparse, but it was meticulously clean. A worn but beautiful quilt was folded on the simple cot. A small collection of blue wildflowers sat in a tin cup on the windowsill. This was not a squatter's den. This was a sanctuary. And he had just invaded it. That side, she said, pointing with her chin to the far wall near the cold fireplace, is yours. This side, she swept her hand to include the cot, the small table, and the hearth is mine. Don't cross the line. He nodded, moving to his designated corner and dropping his gear. He felt like a caged bear, the small space suffocating him. He had come here for a wilderness of solitude, and instead found himself in a prison of proximity. The silence that fell was louder than any cannon fire. It was heavy with questions, with unspoken histories, with the raw, palpable tension of two wounded animals forced to share a cage. The storm broke then with a sudden violent howl of wind that rattled the single window in its frame. The world outside vanished into a swirling vortex of white. They were trapped. Truly trapped. Cora bolted the door, the sound of the heavy wood bar sliding into place echoing in the small room. It was the sound of a choice being made, the sound of a world being shut out and a new, more dangerous one being locked in. The storm descended not as an assault, but as a final suffocating blanket. It erased the world. The wind did not howl. It spoke in a low, unending moan, a lament for the mountains it was trying to tear down. Inside the cabin, the only light came from the hungry, dancing flames in the hearth. The fire threw their shadows against the log walls, making them giants in the small, charred space. Clay sat with his back against the cold logs of his corner, the stone floor seeping a damp chill into his bones. Cora was a silhouette on the other side of the room, a silent watcher on her side of the invisible line she had drawn between them. The silence inside was a living thing, a coiled snake of suspicion and unspoken questions. He had craved silence, had ridden 1,000 miles for it. But this was not the empty, peaceful quiet he had sought. This was a loaded quiet, the breath held before a gunshot. He was a prisoner, not of the storm, but of the woman with the shotgun resting by her side. His eyes, accustomed to measuring dwindling supplies, fell on the small pile of wood beside the hearth. It was shrinking. The fire was eating it with a relentless appetite. In a few hours the cold would own this room. It would creep in through the cracks and steal the breath from their lungs. He had seen men die of the cold. It was a quiet, insidious death, a slow surrender. He would not surrender. He rose to his feet, the sudden movement causing Cora to stiffen her hand, moving instinctively toward the shotgun. "Where are you going?" Her voice was a sharp crack in the roaring silence. Clay pulled on his thin coat, his gaze fixed on the door. Fires burning low. "We need more wood." He could feel her incredulous stare on his back. "Out there in that—" "It's a chore that won't get easier with time," he said, not looking at her. "And the woodpile is just outside the door. Unless you'd prefer to freeze by morning." He didn't wait for an answer. He lifted the heavy bar from the door and the storm lunged at him. A wall of blinding white and furious screaming wind tore into the cabin, threatening to extinguish the precious fire. He fought against it, forcing his way out into the maelstrom and pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The cold was a physical blow. It took his breath, stinging his face with 1,000 icy needles. The world was a churning chaos of snow visibility no more than the length of his own arm. He found the woodpile by memory, a snow-covered mound near the cabin wall. The axe was buried in a stump, its handle slick with ice. He began to chop. The act was a prayer of violence. Each swing of the axe was a punctuation mark in the storm's unending sentence, The shock of the blade biting into the frozen pine jolted up his arms, a pain that felt clean and real. It was a welcome pain. It drowned out the other older aches. With every splintered log, he threw a memory into the wind. The face of a boy from Georgia, his eyes wide with surprise as he fell. The smell of burning canvas. The weight of his wife's hand growing colder in his own. Thwack. Another log split. Thwack. Another ghost banished, if only for a moment. He worked until a respectable pile lay at his feet, until his lungs burned and his sweat was freezing on his brow. He gathered an armload the rough bark digging into his skin and stumbled back to the cabin. He shouldered the door open and kicked it shut, dumping the wood by the hearth with a clatter that broke the room's spell. Snow melted from his coat, puddling on the floor. He did not look at her. He did not expect thanks. He was simply a man tending to the mechanics of survival. He retreated to his corner, a weary soldier returning to his post. He sat for a long time, shivering the warmth of the fire, a distant promise. Then a shadow fell over him. He looked up. Cora stood before him, her face unreadable in the flickering light. She held out a steaming tin cup. Here, she said. He stared at the cup, then at her face. It was the first offering of any kind between them. A white flag in a cold war. He took it. His fingers brushed against hers, a fleeting, shocking warmth. The cup was hot, and he cradled it in his frozen hands. It smelled of herbs and earth. "You'll catch your death," she said, her voice flat, as if stating a simple fact of weather. She retreated to her side of the room before he could answer. He took a sip. The tea was bitter, but it was hot, and the heat spread through his chest like a slow dawning sunrise. The taste was vaguely familiar, a ghost on his tongue. He remembered his mother brewing teas like this for winter fevers. He remembered another woman, her face pale against a lace pillow, too weak to even hold a cup. He pushed the memory down hard and took another long drink of the bitter tea. He noticed she had laid a blanket on the floor in his corner. The night deepened. The storm raged on a wild animal trying to claw its way in. They did not speak again. They were two solitary lighthouses on opposite shores of the same small island, the fire a flickering star in the vast shared darkness between them. Clay leaned his head back against the logs, his body aching with a weariness that went deeper than bone. He came here to escape his ghosts. He never imagined the most dangerous one would be made of flesh and blood, sleeping with a shotgun just 10 feet away. The morning came not with light, but with a change in the quality of the darkness. The wind had quieted its screaming to a low, weary moan. Outside, the world was gone, buried beneath a silent, fathomless ocean of white. Clay woke first. He had not truly slept, but had drifted in a shallow, restless state, his soldier's senses attuned to every creak of the logs, every sigh of the dying fire. He looked across the room. In the weak gray light filtering through the snow-caked window, he could see Cora. She was asleep, curled on her side on the cot, the shotgun resting on the floor beside her like a loyal dog. In sleep, the fortress of her face had fallen. The hard lines of defiance had softened, revealing a vulnerability that was far more disarming than her hostility. He noticed the fine, almost delicate arch of her brow, the graceful line of her throat. There was a refinement to her features that did not belong to this rough-hewn world, a subtle echo of another life. He had seen women on the frontier his whole life. They were carved from the land itself, tough, resilient, their beauty like that of a weathered mesa. She was different. She was like a porcelain doll left out in the wilderness, miraculously unbroken. For now. A soft groan of stressed wood from above broke the silence. A dark wet spot was forming on the ceiling directly over her small table. A leak. The weight of the snow was immense, a heavy hand pressing down, testing the cabin's old bones. Soon, the drip would start. He rose quietly, his movements stiff from the cold floor. He poked the fire, coaxing the embers back to life and adding a few of the logs he'd chopped. The warmth was a blessing. He found a rusty bucket in the corner and, crossing the invisible line between their two worlds without a thought, placed it on the table beneath the growing stain. The sound of him moving in her space woke her instantly. Her eyes snapped open, clear and alert, her hand already reaching for the gun. She saw him, saw the bucket, and followed his gaze to the ceiling. Her posture relaxed, but her eyes remained wary. "Roof's complaining," he said, his voice a low rasp in the quiet room. "It does that," she replied, sitting up, pulling the worn quilt around her shoulders. The old timbers groan. "That's more than a groan. That's a plea for help," he said. "If the snow keeps up, the weight will bring it down on our heads." He looked at her, a direct challenge. "I can fix it, but I'll need your help." She held his gaze, assessing him. This was a new negotiation, not for survival through the night, but for the survival of their shelter. It required trust. It required teamwork. "What do you need?" she finally asked. The work was hard and cold. Clay climbed onto the roof, the world a disorienting swirl of white, and began the brutal task of shoveling away the immense weight of snow. Below, Cora passed him tools and bracing timbers from a small attached shed. They worked in a strange, unspoken rhythm, their communication reduced to single words shouted against the wind. Rope, hammer. More hours passed. They were no longer a captor and a prisoner, a landlord and a squatter. They were simply two people fighting a common enemy, the indifferent, crushing weight of the world. Back inside, huddled by the fire, thawing their frozen fingers, a new kind of silence fell. It was not the tense, hostile silence of before, but a quiet born of shared labor and mutual exhaustion. It was almost peaceful. Almost. Clay's gaze drifted to the stack of books by the hearth. He had noticed them before, but now his curiosity got the better of him. He reached out and picked up the one on top. The leather cover was worn, the title faded, but still legible. Selected Poems of John Keats. He frowned, turning the book over in his hands. He opened it. The pages were filled with elegant, flowing script notes written in the margins in a delicate hand. He looked at the next book. A thick, heavy novel. Wuthering Heights. He looked over at her. She was watching him. Her face guarded her teacup held tight in both hands. "You're a long way from England, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet. Her jaw tightened. A book can travel farther than a person can. "It's not the book," he said, tapping the cover of the Keats. "It's the notes, the handwriting, and the simple fact that you're reading it. Didn't figure you for a poetry reader." "And what did you figure me for?" She snapped, her voice laced with a sudden sharp anger. "Some unlettered savage who spends her days talking to squirrels, a person is allowed to have interests beyond skinning a rabbit. Mr. Blackwood," she knew his name, he had never told her. She must have seen it on the deed in his saddlebag. The thought sent a strange jolt through him. She had investigated him just as he was now investigating her. The slip was revealing. Her defensiveness was a brighter flare than any confession. This was her secret. This was the nerve he had just touched. He had been right. She did not belong here. Which begged the question, what was a woman who read poetry and had the hands of a lady doing hiding in a forgotten cabin at the end of the world? That evening, she shared her food with him. A thin stew of salted pork and dried beans. They ate in silence, the questions hanging unspoken between them. The fragile truce held, but it was shifting, changing into something more complex. He was no longer just wary of her. He was intrigued. As she was washing the tin plates by the fire, it happened. A small dry cough escaped her lips. Then another, this one deeper, a rattling sound that seemed to shake her small frame. She tried to stifle it, turning away from him, but it was too late. Clay froze his blood, turning to ice in his veins. It was just a cough, a small human sound in the quiet room. But to Clay, it was a ghost. It was the exact sound he had heard in another room in another lifetime. It was the sound of the end beginning all over again, and a terror he thought he had buried long ago seized him by the throat. The sound was a key turning a lock on a door deep inside him that he had sworn to keep sealed forever. A door to a quiet, sun-drenched room that smelled of lavender and slow death. Cora's cough. It was a small rattling thing, but for Clay it was a thunderclap. His blood went instantly terribly cold. The warmth from the fire vanished. The howling of the storm faded to a distant hum. He was no longer in a snowbound cabin in Montana. He was back in a suffocatingly still room in Pennsylvania, watching the life fade from his wife Sarah's eyes, listening to this exact terrible rhythm, the harbinger of the end. "It's nothing," Cora rasped, turning away from him, her shoulders hunched. "Just a chill from the roof." "No," Clay said, and the voice that came out of him was not his own. It was the voice of the soldier, the field medic, the man who had seen too much death to mistake its signature. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, violating the line between their worlds without a second thought. He knelt beside her cot. "Don't lie to me." She flinched as he reached out, but his hand was surprisingly steady as he placed it against her forehead. The heat that radiated from her skin was a familiar, terrifying fire. "You're burning up," he said, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion. It was the only way to keep the panic from swallowing him whole. "How long, I don't know." A few days, she admitted, her voice weak, her pride finally crumbling under the weight of the fever. "It comes and goes." Pain. He pressed his eyes, scanning her face, looking for the telltale signs he knew so well. "In your chest, your joints, my stomach." "Mostly," she whispered, her eyes fluttering shut, like a fire made of glass. The night became a waking nightmare, a war fought in the trenches of memory. The storm outside was a pale imitation of the one raging inside Clay's head. Cora's fever climbed, and she began to drift lost in the gray, foggy lands between consciousness and whatever lay beyond. She mumbled names he didn't know. "He'll find me, Father." "Don't let him." She spoke of a man named Alistair, of garden parties in Boston, of the salt smell of the ocean. Her secrets spilled out in fevered whispers, painting a picture of a gilded cage she had fled. But Clay barely heard them. He was fighting his own ghosts. Every time he placed a cool, damp cloth on her brow, it was Sarah's face he saw. Every time he coaxed a sip of water past her dry lips, it was Sarah's name he almost whispered. He was back there in that helpless, desperate time, a powerless man watching the person he loved most be consumed by an enemy he could not see and could not fight. No, a voice inside him roared. Not again. This time was different. This time he was not helpless. He was a soldier. And a soldier does not abandon his post. Driven by a desperate, ferocious energy, he began to search. He tore through her meager supplies, his hands sifting through dried herbs and roots. He recognized some willow bark for fever yarrow to stop bleeding. Simple frontier remedies. Nothing for a sickness this deep, this venomous. He found her books, the poetry of Keats and the dark romance of the Moors, and in a fit of rage and grief he almost threw them into the fire. What good were pretty words against the hard, ugly reality of death? He stopped himself, his hand trembling. This wasn't Sarah. This was Cora. The anger was his own. The fear was his own. He had to think. He forced himself to be a soldier again, to be tactical. An enemy is sickness. What is the source? What is the supply line? He thought back through the last 2 days. The food was simple, salted pork and beans. The air was clean if cold. The only other thing was the water. He stood perfectly still. He remembered the water from the bucket. The taste. It wasn't off, not really. But there had been a faint, almost unnoticeable aftertaste. A slight metallic tang like old blood or a new coin. He dismissed it. His heart began to pound a slow, heavy drum of dread. He strode to the water bucket he had filled from the creek himself. He dipped his fingers in and brought them to his tongue. There it was, faint but undeniable. He looked at Cora, at her pale face, at the almost imperceptible bluish tint to her lips, a detail he had seen before in men who had drunk from tainted wells near mining camps. A fire made of glass, she had said. This wasn't a fever from God. This wasn't the ghost of his wife's illness come back to haunt him. This was poison. He looked from the tainted water in his hands to the still pale form on the cot. Then his gaze lifted, moving past the fire, past the walls of the cabin, to the door that led out into the white, silent world. The storm was no longer the enemy. The solitude was no longer a fortress. It was a tomb. This was a bullet fired slow and quiet into the heart of the valley. And Clay Blackwood knew with a sudden soul-freezing certainty that the war had followed him home. The ghost in the fevered room was gone. In its place stood an enemy of flesh and blood. Clay Blackwood moved with a terrifying calm, the panic burned away and replaced by a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He was a soldier again, the battlefield, this small, snow-choked cabin, the objective, singular, and absolute preserve the life of the woman on the cot. He ground charcoal from the fire into dust, his knuckles white. He mixed it with clean snowmelt, creating a dark, gritty slurry. A prayer against poison. He gently lifted Cordelia's head, tipping the mixture past her lips. She was no longer a stranger, no longer a trespasser. She was the ground he had to hold. He spent the next hours in silent, purposeful action, preparing for a war he knew was coming. He did not have to wait long. As the storm's fury began to wane, two figures emerged from the swirling snow. Clay saw them from the window, two dark shapes moving with the arrogance of men who believe they are coming to claim a prize from the dead. Bartlett. His face was pinched and greedy, even from a distance. The man beside him was a hulking brute, a walking slab of muscle and malice. They were vultures. Clay stood by the hearth, the firelight casting long shadows, the heavy wood axe resting in his hands. He waited. Bartlett shoved the door open, a cruel grin on his face. "Well now," he said, stepping in from the cold. "Looks like the storm did our work for us. Let's see what the little bird left." He stopped. His grin dissolved into a mask of pure shock. Clay stood there, a silent pillar of judgment. Blackwood Bartlett stammered, "You're alive." "The storm wasn't the problem," Bartlett Clay said, his voice as cold and quiet as the grave Bartlett had intended for him. "The water was." Recognition, then raw panic, flashed in Bartlett's eyes. He fumbled for his pistol. But Clay had been fighting this battle in his head for hours. He moved before Bartlett's gun had cleared its holster, swinging the axe not as a weapon to kill, but as a tool to break. He brought the flat of the heavy blade down hard against Bartlett's wrist. A sickening crack echoed in the cabin, followed by a scream of agony. The pistol flew from a hand that would never hold a gun again. The brute charged a roar in his throat. Clay pivoted, letting the man's momentum carry him past, and drove his shoulder hard into the man's back, sending him crashing face first into the corner of the stone hearth. He went down in a heap and did not move. The fight was over. It had lasted less than 10 seconds. Clay stood over the whimpering Bartlett, his chest heaving. With a cold efficiency, he bound the man's good hand with a strip of leather. He searched his pockets, looking for anything, and his fingers closed around a folded, dirty piece of paper. He pulled it out. It was a letter written in a rough, barely legible scrawl. An unsent letter. His eyes scanned the words, and the world tilted on its axis once more. To Mr. Julian Barrett Boston it began. "Sir, I believe I have found the woman you're looking for. She is living on my former property in the Montana Territory. She calls herself Cora. Please advise as to the reward for her safe return. Julian Barrett," the name Cordelia had whispered in her delirium. The man she had fled. Clay felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the storm. This was not about a small plot of land or a rumor of gold. It had never been. He had stumbled into the middle of a hunt, a 1,000-mile pursuit orchestrated by a powerful, unseen enemy. He looked from the damning letter in his hand to the pale woman sleeping on the cot, her life saved from one poison, only to be threatened by a far more dangerous one. Later, as the first rays of a weak sun broke through the clouds, he dragged the two men outside. He put the unconscious one over his own horse and forced Bartlett to walk his broken wrist, a testament to his failure. He took their guns, left them a single blanket, and pointed them east. "Start walking," he said. "If I ever see you in this valley again, I'll finish what I started." He watched until they were small, pathetic specks in the vast whiteness, then he turned and walked back inside. Cordelia was stirring, a soft murmur escaping her lips. He stood over her for a long moment, the unsent letter clutched in his hand. He could tell her. He could share this new, terrifying burden. Instead, he walked to the fire and dropped the paper into the flames. He watched it curl, blacken, and turn to ash, taking its secret with it. He would carry this weight alone. For now, he had come to this valley seeking an end to his war. He now understood with absolute certainty it had only just begun. Clay stood there, a silent pillar of judgment. Blackwood Bartlett stammered, "You're alive." The storm wasn't the problem, Bartlett Clay said, his voice as cold and quiet as the grave Bartlett had intended for him. The water was. Recognition, then raw panic, flashed in Bartlett's eyes. He fumbled for his pistol. But Clay had been fighting this battle in his head for hours. He moved before Bartlett's gun had cleared its holster, swinging the axe not as a weapon to kill, but as a tool to break. He brought the flat of the heavy blade down hard against Bartlett's wrist. A sickening crack echoed in the cabin, followed by a scream of agony. The pistol flew from a hand that would never hold a gun again. The brute charged a roar in his throat. Clay pivoted, letting the man's momentum carry him past, and drove his shoulder hard into the man's back, sending him crashing face first into the corner of the stone hearth. He went down in a heap and did not move. The fight was over. It had lasted less than 10 seconds. Clay stood over the whimpering Bartlett, his chest heaving. With a cold efficiency, he bound the man's good hand with a strip of leather. He searched his pockets looking for anything, and his fingers closed around a folded, dirty piece of paper. He pulled it out. It was a letter written in a rough, barely legible scrawl. An unsent letter. His eyes scanned the words, and the world tilted on its axis once more. To Mr. Julian Barrett, Boston, it began. "Sir, I believe I have found the woman you're looking for. She is living on my former property in the Montana Territory. She calls herself Cora. Please advise as to the reward for her safe return. Julian Barrett," the name Cordelia had whispered in her delirium. The man she had fled. Clay felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the storm. This was not about a small plot of land or a rumor of gold. It had never been. He had stumbled into the middle of a hunt, a 1,000-mile pursuit, orchestrated by a powerful, unseen enemy. He looked from the damning letter in his hand to the pale woman sleeping on the cot, her life saved from one poison only to be threatened by a far more dangerous one. Later, as the first rays of a weak sun broke through the clouds, he dragged the two men outside. He put the unconscious one over his own horse and forced Bartlett to walk his broken wrist, a testament to his failure. He took their guns, left them a single blanket, and pointed them east. "Start walking," he said. "If I ever see you in this valley again, I'll finish what I started." He watched until they were small, pathetic specks in the vast whiteness, then he turned and walked back inside. Cordelia was stirring, a soft murmur escaping her lips. He stood over her for a long moment, the unsent letter clutched in his hand. He could tell her. he could share this new, terrifying burden. Instead, he walked to the fire and dropped the paper into the flames. He watched it curl blacken and turn to ash, taking its secret with it. He would carry this weight alone. For now. He had come to this valley seeking an end to his war. He now understood with absolute certainty it had only just begun. He had stumbled into the middle of a hunt, a 1,000-mile pursuit orchestrated by a powerful, unseen enemy. He looked from the damning letter in his hand to the pale woman sleeping on the cot, her life saved from one poison, only to be threatened by a far more dangerous one. Later, as the first rays of a weak sun broke through the clouds, he dragged the two men outside. He put the unconscious one over his own horse and forced Bartlett to walk his broken wrist, a testament to his failure. He took their guns, left them a single blanket, and pointed them east. "Start walking," he said. "If I ever see you in this valley again, I'll finish what I started." He watched until they were small, pathetic specks in the vast whiteness, then he turned and walked back inside. Cordelia was stirring, a soft murmur escaping her lips. He stood over her for a long moment, the unsent letter clutched in his hand. He could tell her. He could share this new, terrifying burden. Instead, he walked to the fire and dropped the paper into the flames. He watched it curl blacken and turn to ash, taking its secret with it. He would carry this weight alone. For now. He had come to this valley seeking an end to his war. He now understood with absolute certainty it had only just begun.